Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering multiple cases. And I'm sure you're wondering what I'm talking about and how I'd find time to research different cases for one single episode. And normally every week I try to do like a quick 30-second rundown on the case that I'm covering. But this case, I think I'd like to just kind of surprise you instead. Because if you've never heard this case before, or if you're unfamiliar with it, then it's quite literally going to blow your mind. There are just way too many twists and turns for it not to blow your mind. And normally I'd get a lot more into the background and the childhoods of the people that I'm covering and talking about. But again, in this case, there's already so much information to take in within this case that it's insane. So instead, I'm switching things up just a little bit, so bear with me this week. I decided to start the episode right where the crime started. So, without further ado, let's get it. Alright, picture it. It's 2012. The iPhone 5 was the newest iPhone available on the market. 2 Chainz, Justin Bieber, Carrie Underwood, Lee Brice, and Katy Perry, they're all taking over the music world. And then there was Dave. Dave Kroupa was 35 years old, and he was a newly single father. Dave had just moved to Omaha, Nebraska, and when I say Dave was newly single, I mean that he had just gotten out of a 12-year relationship with his baby mama, Amy. Dave and Amy split up pretty amicably, and it really wasn't a big thing. They got along well enough, but neither one of them were really feeling being together anymore. The couple had actually decided to split because Dave wasn't really into the whole marriage thing, and Amy felt like she needed more. Sure, the two had kids together, and sure, they were, for all intents and purposes, married. They lived together like any other married couple. But after Dave and Amy had one of their kids together, Amy was holding their new baby, and, she was pretty emotional. She had just had a baby. Babies will do that. And she looked up at Dave and told him that she loved him, which is, I feel like a normal thing that happens in a delivery room. But instead of Dave saying that he loved Amy too, he said thank you instead. And I would have to assume that that was probably when Amy realized that this relationship wasn't really going any further than it had in the last 12 years. So Dave had just gotten out of this relationship with the mother of his kids, Amy, and he'd moved into kind of like a bachelor pad of sorts in Omaha, Nebraska. Dave hadn't taken any of the furniture from the house that he shared with Amy and the kids when he moved out because his kids and Amy still lived there. And he wanted his kids and his ex-girlfriend to be able to have all the normal house necessities that they would need. Dave was also working a job as the manager at an auto mechanic shop, or as we in the South like to say, he was a real mechanic. He wasn't one of those shade tree mechanics where your Uncle Jeff knows somebody who isn't actually a mechanic, but they know how to work on cars pretty good. Dave was a real mechanic. And since Dave had been out of the dating world for more than a decade, he was a little bit rusty, and he felt like it would probably be the easiest, newest, fastest, and probably the most popular way to meet somebody would be to try a few online dating apps. So he made a free account on Plenty of Fish, which is a free dating app for singles who are ready to mingle, or so I've heard. But Dave wasn't looking to jump into anything new. He wasn't looking for long-term. He wasn't looking for a committed relationship. Dave was looking more for a casual and easy type of thing. Something more along the lines of friends with benefits, which is fine. Not everyone is out searching for their forever love at every point in their lives. He wanted companionship without the commitment. In his 30s and fresh out of a long-term relationship, Dave knew at this point exactly what he was looking for, and he was looking for something easy and casual, so that's exactly what he went out searching for. Dave dated multiple women throughout the next few months, and he was extremely open and honest with every woman that he met as far as what he was looking for. So he wasn't just out here sleeping with different women and leading them to believe that, this might turn into a real relationship or something serious. Dave told every woman that he was seeing other women and that he was basically just looking for casual hookups. And all of the women that Dave had been seeing were aware that, Dave wasn't looking for anything serious, and they were aware that he was seeing other people. So basically they knew exactly what they were getting into with Dave when they met him. And one of the very first women that Dave had met through Plenty of Fish was a woman by the name of Liz. And Liv and Dave hit it off instantly. Their kids were about the same age, so they were both single parents. And Liz was pretty, she was funny, and she was great in bed, which is basically everything you'd want in a woman if you were looking. Liz also owned her own cleaning business, and it seemed like she and Dave had a lot in common. So they talked on the dating app for a little while before they decided to meet up in person for their first date. And they went for coffee and they just kind of talked about life, and the two seemed to be hitting it off even better in person than they had been online. But Dave was still upfront about what he was looking for, and he made sure to be very clear with Liz that he was only looking for a friendship and casual hookups if she was okay with that, which it seemed like she was. And even though Dave and Liz had been casually dating off and on for about 6 months, Liz still wasn't the only woman that Dave had been seeing. He'd also been seeing and hanging out with multiple other women. There was Mary, Kathy, Sandra, Beth, and that's just a few. So it kind of seems like Dave was like a teenager who had been like helicopter parented their entire life. Like you give them just a little bit of freedom, and they go absolutely buck wild with it. But Dave deserved it. He wasn't hiding his intentions from anybody, and he wasn't lying to anybody. So what was the worst that could happen? Well, Dave was about to find out. In October of 2012, Dave was at work one afternoon going through his usual shift when a Ford Explorer pulled up into the mechanic shop where he worked. And when the car stopped, out stepped Cari Farver, and Cari was beautiful. Dave felt like there was an instant connection between the two of them, but the opportunity was kind of missed when the two didn't exchange numbers or contact information. Or at least they'd both thought that this had been a missed opportunity, because it was a little while later when Dave was scrolling through his phone, checking his newest messages or swipes or however dating apps work, and this is the same dating site that he had met Liz and some of the other women on. So while he's scrolling, he sees a familiar face, and he'd stumbled across Cari's dating profile. And this was Dave's last chance to shoot his shot, so he sent Cari a message through the dating site. And when Cari realized that the message was from the hot mechanic that she'd met a few days before, naturally she agreed to go to dinner with him. So Dave and Cari were fancy like Applebee's on a date night, and that's where they went. And they really hit it off. Cari was a 37-year-old computer programmer, and she was also a single parent raising her 14-year-old son, Max. She was funny and spunky and independent and attractive. And again, everything you'd be looking for in a woman if you were looking. And Dave and Cari had hit it off so easily at dinner that when they were heading out of the restaurant, Dave asked if Cari might want to go back to his place, and she said yeah. But while Dave and Cari had been out to dinner, Dave was getting a lot of calls and texts from Liz, the other woman that he'd been seeing off and on for a few months. And Liz had been trying to get in touch with Dave to get some of the things that she'd left at his house. Dave just asked Liz if she could wait till another time to stop by and pick him up. He let Liz know that he was busy and that he was on a date, and Dave assumed that that would be the end of that conversation. But it was no sooner than Cari and Dave walked inside of Dave's apartment that Liz was buzzing the security button downstairs asking to come up and gather her things that she'd left at Dave's place. So naturally, Dave's feeling kind of annoyed and pretty awkward at this point. He'd already told Liz that it was a bad time to stop by. And he'd also just brought Cari back to his place after their very first date. And now he had Liz asking to come up and get her stuff. And the only thing there was like a toothbrush and a few kitchen utensils, things that had been at Dave's house for months. But regardless, Dave just kind of apologized to Cari and he asked if he could call her later. And Cari honestly did not seem fazed whatsoever about some random woman knocking on Dave's door. She told him that it would be fine to call later when he got everything taken care of with Liz. Cari even told Dave something like, "Oh, we've all been there with a crazy ex coming to get their stuff. Like, don't worry about it. Just call me later." So Cari heads out of Dave's apartment, and as Cari's walking out the building, Liz is walking in. And they basically just walk by each other. It wasn't even really what I would consider an interaction. Like, they didn't speak to each other, and Cari wasn't acting like it was a big deal. Liz walked into Dave's apartment, and she gathered up a few clothing items, some cooking utensils, and whatever else she'd left at his house. And after that, she left. And after Liz had finally got her things, Dave decided he was going to go ahead and call Cari to apologize again for having to cut the date short. And Cari was still in her car driving the hour commute back to her place. Cari asked if Dave might want to ride over to her house, and even though it was already like 9 p.m., and even though it was like an hour drive from where Dave lived to where Cari lived, Dave figured that Cari was worth the drive, and he really liked her. And Cari wasn't just driving an hour for a date with Dave. She actually coincidentally worked right down the street from Dave's house, so that all kind of worked out. So Dave decides he's going to make this hour drive to Cari's house that night, right after Liz had left from picking her things up from his apartment. And once Dave made it to Cari's place, the two talked for hours and hours. And then, like they do, things kind of started getting a little hot and heavy. But before things went too much further, Cari stopped Dave and she told him that she wasn't looking for a relationship and that she wasn't looking for any kind of commitment, that she just wanted casual companionship and, hookups if they were both okay with it. Which was perfect because that was exactly what Dave was looking for too. Dave even later says that he couldn't have asked for things to work out any better with Cari that night. Dave also said that he kind of felt like he'd hit the jackpot when he'd met Cari. She seemed perfect for what Dave was looking for in his life right now. And after this first night between Dave and Cari, they started hanging out more and more often over the next week or so. Cari had even asked what Dave thought about a car that she'd bought for her teenage son, Max. Like, the first week was going perfectly. And it was actually going so good that Dave had offered to let Cari stay at his house overnight a few days a week because she was working like crazy long, sporadic hours. Hell, he even gave her a key to his place. Cari had started working on a new project at work, and she was having to go in a lot earlier than normal and having to work a lot later than normal. And she was also still having to make the hour-long commute back and forth to her job and house every day. But Dave, he lived right down the road from her job. So it took Cari an hour to get to work in the mornings and then another hour to get home in the evenings. And if Cari decided to stay with Dave, her son Max could stay with his grandparents, and this would save Cari a lot of time and a lot of gas money if she just stayed at Dave's a few nights a week until she finished this big project. This wasn't any kind of commitment between either Cari or Dave. They'd even talked about it. This was just kind of a way for Dave to be able to help Cari out. So Dave and Cari had only known each other for 2 weeks, and Cari was already spending multiple nights a week at Dave's place. So suffice to say that things were going better than good between these two. And then something happened. On November 13th, 2012, Dave got up and started getting dressed for work. Cari was already awake, sitting on her laptop, working on that big project for her programming company. Dave had to be at work early that day, and Cari was planning to get dressed and head to work shortly after Dave left for work. Dave kissed Cari, and he left for work, and this is where things went from bliss to shit. Dave was at work that morning when he got a text from Cari at about 10 a.m. Cari's text definitely took Dave by surprise. She was asking if the two of them should move in together. And Dave thought this was weird because they had both been really clear that they did not want anything serious and that they did not want any kind of commitment. And aside from that, they'd only been dating for 2 weeks. Why would she be asking if they should move in together? That's a big step to take with somebody that you've only known for 2 weeks. Dave texted Cari back with a text that just simply said no, and almost immediately after he'd sent the word no back to Cari, he got another text from her. And this time she was saying something along the lines of, like, fuck you, I never want to see you again, I'm dating somebody else anyways. So Cari had just went from, hey, you want to move in together, to I hate you and I never want to see you again. But Dave was busy, he was at work, and he kind of thought that he'd just dodged a bullet. Maybe Cari had been putting on an act for the first 2 weeks that they'd been dating. Maybe this was just her showing her true colors. Maybe it would be best for both of them if they didn't have to see each other again. So like I said, Dave was kind of thinking he dodged a bullet. But he was kind of dreading going home and Cari being there. He didn't really want confrontation, and that was going to be a real awkward talk. But when Dave got off of work and got home, Cari's car and all of her things were gone. It even looked like Cari had never even been inside of his apartment, which was kind of a relief for Dave. It was the same day that Dave had gotten the text asking if he and Cari should move in together that Cari's mom, Nancy, had also gotten a pretty weird text. Cari had texted her mom to let her know that she was moving to Kansas for a new job. Cari's mom, Nancy, was kind of taken aback by this because as far as her mom knew, Cari loved her job and she had just started working on that big project. Cari also hadn't mentioned anything to her mom about a new job before this. And Cari and her mom, Nancy, talked every day. They were extremely close. So Cari not mentioning a new job and moving was really strange. Cari's mom, Nancy, tried to call her daughter a few different times, but she didn't get an answer. So when Nancy asked Cari's son, Max, about the move, he said that his mom had mentioned a job in Kansas, but that it had only really been mentioned in passing. So that didn't really make a whole lot of sense to Nancy either. It didn't really make her feel better about the situation. So Cari's mom, Nancy, figured that Cari's son would just stay with her and she would talk to Cari later on at a wedding. Because Nancy was sure that she would see Cari that weekend. Cari's brother was getting married, so Nancy figured she would get the full scoop on what was going on then. But little did everybody know, Cari had also not shown up to work on November 13th. And she was one of the company's most reliable employees, so that was completely out of character as far as her not showing up and not keeping in touch. But it was even weirder that Cari had checked in with her job about the progress of the project that she'd been working on, and she checked in at 6:30 a.m. So why would she check in about the progress of a project and then not show up to work shortly after? Cari sent in a letter of resignation for her job, but she'd sent the name of a woman who she thought might be able to replace her. It was all super weird. And while all of this was going on, Dave's phone is blowing up. Cari is sending back-to-back text messages multiple times a day. And it wasn't long before Dave's old fling Liz got in touch with Dave asking how Cari had gotten her number. Now, Dave had no idea what Liz was even talking about. So when he asked, what the hell are you talking about? Liz said that Cari had been sending her text messages and blowing her phone up too. Liz had been getting text messages that said she was Dave's whore and calling her some pretty foul names, and being called Dave's whore was actually one of the nicer texts that Liz had gotten from Cari. Dave had no idea how Cari would have gotten Liz's number. They'd only ever seen each other once in passing. And that had been, a week or so ago. When Dave and Cari had gone back to his place after their first date and Liz had insisted on stopping by to get her stuff. But the two women hadn't spoken to each other and they'd only walked past each other for mere seconds. So Liz or Dave, either one, couldn't really figure out how Cari had gotten Liz's number to be able to text her. But days had gone by and Cari's mom, Nancy, still hadn't seen or heard anything from her daughter aside from text messages. Cari had been refusing to answer calls from her mom or her son or any other family member for that matter, and she wasn't calling any of them either. Now, mind you, Cari was extremely close with her mom and they talked every day up until this point. Most days, Cari and her mom, Nancy, talked multiple times a day. So not talking to Cari at all for days on end was extremely alarming for Nancy. It was also pretty alarming to everybody because Cari's son Max was her entire world. No one knew why she wasn't answering his calls and why she wasn't calling in to check, why she wasn't calling to check in on him. And Cari's son had been staying with her parents since nobody had seen her. Cari's mom, Nancy, was done playing this cat and mouse game and, Cari had already not showed up for her brother's wedding, and that's when Nancy knew something had to be wrong. Cari had always been extremely family-oriented, and she would never just not show up to something this important. So it was only a few days after Cari had texted Dave asking if they should move in together, and after she'd stopped communicating with everybody in her family, aside from text messages, that Cari's mom, Nancy, went to report her missing. The text messages that Nancy was getting from Cari were alarming for a few different reasons. Firstly, because they all talked about not coming back and not wanting to be found. And secondly, because Cari was meticulous about her grammar, spelling, and punctuation. And in all of these texts that Nancy was getting from her daughter, everything was misspelled and rarely any punctuation was used. And we all know that if you text someone all the time, you know how they spell certain words, if they use commas or periods or not. You know if they use shortcuts for certain words. Like, you just learn their typing habits. Like, if my husband or best friend, either one, texted me and everything was spelled out correctly and they'd use commas where commas go and put periods in between sentences or capitalized letters when they started a new sentence, then I would know within the first few words that I was not talking to either one of them. But Cari's mom wasn't the only one noticing the difference in the way Cari was texting. Because Dave had been so attracted to Cari because she was so well-read and smart. And because he could hold a meaningful conversation with her. And now the texts that Dave were getting from Cari were full of swear words and nothing was spelled correctly. It was like two totally different people. But Dave had only known Cari for 2 weeks. He kind of figured that, she had been pretending to be so well-read and educated. People are normally on their best behavior during the first 6 months or so of a new relationship. So maybe she had just been putting on a good front and maybe she wasn't all of these incredible things that Dave thought. So Dave was past the point of being confused by Cari's sudden change in behavior because he had gone from confused to relieved, honestly, just thinking that he dodged a bullet and, kind of glad that he was able to, pull himself back from that situation. So when Nancy called the police, they told Nancy exactly what you're assuming they would tell her, that Cari was a 37-year-old woman and that, they told her that Cari may not be missing, that she may just not want to be found. Basically, the cops give Nancy the spiel about how adults are allowed to cut themselves off from family and friends and that there isn't really much that they can do. Police knew that Cari had still been texting her mom, so they just kind of assumed that she was missing on purpose. But after a few more weeks of Cari still not showing her face to anyone and still only communicating with everyone through text messages or emails, police finally did start to wonder if maybe something else was going on. Cari had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder in her early 20s, and she'd gone off her meds a few times before. But Cari's mom, Nancy, said that the meds often made Cari feel numb to any kind of emotion, and she hated feeling numb. So after hearing this information, police kind of assumed that maybe Cari was in a manic state, which would explain why the rapid mood changes and the sudden unusual behavior. But manic states don't usually last weeks and months and years. And besides that, Cari had been in a really good place in her life before this, one strange day that just changed everything. Nancy also told police about Dave, and all that Nancy really knew about Dave was that he was a new man in Cari's life and that Cari had been spending a few nights a week with Dave. She explained that Dave just lived right up the road from where Cari worked and that it had made it easier to stay with him than to drive the hour one way to work back and forth. But Nancy didn't know Dave personally and she'd never met him. She'd only heard of him from Cari before her odd behavior started. But it had been long enough at this point of her being gone with no real explanation even as an adult. So police eventually just text Cari, and they let her know that they had made a missing persons report on her, and police let her know that she could meet with an officer just to prove that she was okay. Police told Cari that if she could meet with an officer and at least prove that she was alive and okay, that the officers wouldn't be allowed to tell her family where she was. Basically saying they would just have to tell her family that, she was gone, but they needed some kind of proof that she was okay. So police weren't even going to tell Cari's family where she was if she would have just met up with them. They just needed to physically lay eyes on her so that they knew she wasn't actually a missing person. But Cari texted the officers back and said that she didn't care if she was reported as a missing person, that she wasn't meeting with anyone, not anyone in her family and not an officer, that she wasn't missing, that she just didn't want to be found. She just wanted to be left alone, which again sounds a lot like some sort of manic break happening, especially from somebody who never normally exhibited these types of behaviors. Police were able to track down Dave and to ask him about Cari and her whereabouts, but Dave didn't even know that Cari had been reported missing because she had absolutely been blowing his phone up. Dave showed all the text messages to the officers that he had been receiving from Cari, and Dave even told them about how Cari had somehow gotten Liz's number and that now Cari had been harassing Liz too. So police are starting to put together that Dave had been dating Liz and Cari at the same time, so naturally, police are going to need to go talk to Liz to see what her thoughts were. Liz cooperated with police when they showed up at her house to ask her about Cari and the situation at hand. Liz showed the police mounds and mounds of texts that she'd been getting from Cari every day, along with all the threatening emails and nasty words. But then Liz told the officers that they might be interested in something that had happened in her garage a few days before they'd come to talk to her. Liz takes these officers into her garage and shows them that one of the walls in her garage had been spray painted. The spray paint spelled out whore from Dave. And Liz told police that she suspected that Cari was the one that had broken into her garage and vandalized it. Liz also claimed that one of her checkbooks had gone missing the same day that she'd come home and her garage had been spray painted. She also said that there had been a check for $5,000 written out of that missing checkbook, but that the check had bounced. Liz was also sure that Cari had been the one who had stolen her checkbook and written the $5,000 check. At this point, Dave and Cari were getting somewhere between 50 and 100 text messages and emails a day, and this went on for literal years. When police looked a little more into Cari's cell phone pings after they'd first talked to Liz, they found that when Cari's phone was sending those text messages and emails that she was usually pretty close by to where Liz lived, which just validated what Liz was saying to the officers. It would make sense for Cari to be nearby Liz's house if Cari was stalking her like she claimed. So the officers thanked Liz for her time and cooperation, and they told her if she needed anything else, or if anything else happened, to get in touch with them. Liz agreed and the officers left. Now, Dave was getting text messages that said things along the lines of, "I hate you so much that I want to drive a knife in your heart," which is weird. And Dave's ex-girlfriend and baby mama, Amy, had also started getting threatening texts and emails from Cari too. But Amy's texts were saying something more along the lines of, like, leave Dave alone or else. And Amy and Dave had kids together. There is no leaving each other alone, whether they're in a relationship or not. That's not how that works. Cari had also tried telling Dave in December of 2012 that she was pregnant. But Dave was pretty sure that that was close to impossible. You see, Dave had had a vasectomy years before he'd ever met Cari. So her being pregnant was highly, highly unlikely. And Dave didn't know it at the time, but Cari also wasn't able to have any more kids. But that's not something that he would learn for years after this whole ordeal was finally able to be sorted out. So Cari still hadn't been physically seen by anyone. This was all just on texts and emails. Eventually, Liz and Dave take all these texts and emails to police to let them know that they're both being stalked and harassed by Cari, which just made things a little bit more complicated because nobody that was involved in the case knew that Cari was being looked for in Iowa as a missing persons case and as a mom who'd abandoned her teenage son. But police in Nebraska were looking for Cari for stalking and harassing and vandalizing people and their things. Dave and Cari both lived right on the other side of the lines from Iowa and Nebraska. Dave had lived in Nebraska and Cari had lived in Iowa. And just like most other cases where crimes happen in two different jurisdictions, neither of these two states knew about the other being on the lookout for Cari. Because by this point, it was evident that Cari was legitimately stalking Dave, and I mean like the definition of stalking. Dave would be like getting out of the shower and he would get a text from Cari that says like, "Oh, I see you just got out the shower." And then there were other times that Dave would get a text from Cari saying something along the lines of, "I see you sitting in the chair with your feet propped up in your blue t-shirt and gray sweatpants." And Dave would look down to see that his feet were actually propped up and that he was actually wearing a blue t-shirt and gray sweatpants watching TV. And those kinds of texts just let Dave know that Cari was actually watching him. And when he would get these kinds of texts, he would always run outside to see if he could spot Cari outside of his apartment building. But by the time that he got out there, there was always no trace of Cari anywhere. And these types of things happened all the time, and Liz was getting just as many texts and emails from Cari, and they just kept getting nastier and nastier. But then something else happened in December of 2012. Right after Cari had magically, supposedly gotten pregnant, her dad passed away. Now, Cari's dad had been battling with cancer, but once Cari's dad passed away, everybody in her family was positive that Cari would show up to her dad's funeral. If nothing else could get Cari to show her face, that would be it. But Cari never showed up, and she never really explained why she didn't show up. And it was very shortly after Cari's dad's funeral that her mom, Nancy, had an extremely vivid dream. The dream was kind of startling to Nancy. It was a dream that she'd had of Cari's dad and Nancy's late husband. And he was telling Nancy that Cari was okay and that she was with him now. This dream had been so real and so vivid that it woke Nancy up. Cari texted her mom, Nancy, after the funeral saying that she was sorry that she'd missed it. But she couldn't show up to this funeral, but she was still updating and making posts all over her Facebook page. But those weren't happening on Cari's regular Facebook feed, but it was on new accounts that had been made in Cari's name. So Cari's son, Max, had had enough, and he'd finally sent his mom a message, and he just said, "Hi." Cari replied with, "Hey, little man," which is weird because he's like a 14 or 15-year-old teenage boy at this point. So I don't see his mom calling him little man still, but I could be wrong. But Max had messaged his mom, Cari, and asked, "If you're really my mom, then answer these 3 simple questions." These were questions that he thought that only his mom would know. He asked, "What's my middle name? What was the name of my best friend growing up? And what was the name of our first boxer?" And the boxer would be in reference to a dog that they'd had when Max was younger. And all 3 of these questions should have been super easy for his mom to answer, but Cari never replied to any of them. And even though Cari had unfriended Dave on Facebook the day that she'd asked to move in with him and he declined, there was a Facebook post that was made with a picture of a hand and a ring on it. And it said that she and Dave are getting married. And when Cari's mom, Nancy, saw this post, she was sure that the fingers in that picture were not Cari's fingers. But no matter how badly Cari's family all suspected that whoever had Cari's phone and her Facebook login information was an imposter, They still couldn't prove it. It was all just speculation, but with Christmas approaching, Cari's mom Nancy and her son Max were really hoping that Cari would show up for the holidays, and again, she never did. It had been well over a month since anybody had actually laid eyes on Cari at this point, and Cari had texted Dave claiming that she'd moved into the same apartment complex that he lived in. Dave had even gone so far as to try to flirt back with Cari when she would text him, just to try to get her to come out of hiding so police could get her, but it never worked. And then at the beginning of January 2013, Dave was driving through his apartment complex going home when he spotted Cari's Ford Explorer in the parking lot. Now, he knew that this was Cari's car because that's how they'd met. Cari had brought her car into Dave's mechanic shop to be worked on. Dave was so sure that this was Cari's car that he called police to report that he'd spotted it in the apartment complex. Police knew about the stalking and the harassment, and, once they arrived, they had Cari's car towed, and they actually even brought in an evidence technician to go through the vehicle with a fine-tooth comb. But after the evidence technician had already gone through the car, they found nothing, literally nothing at all. The car had been completely wiped down to the point that there weren't even fingerprints anywhere in the car. They were only able to collect one single solitary fingerprint throughout the entire car. And that fingerprint had been found in the middle console on a mint container. Like an Altoids container, something like that. A little small mint container that was just like laying in the middle console. There was no way to know the gender, age, or race from a single fingerprint, especially if the person's print that it wasn't in the system. But police kept it, and they ran it through multiple databases with no luck. And since there really wasn't anything of evidentiary value in the car, police had no choice but to release the car back to Cari's mom, Nancy. Nancy had wanted to give the car to Cari's son, Max. He was about to get his license and start driving, so, they needed a vehicle. But once the car was dropped off with Cari's mom, Nancy, and her son, Max, Nancy was convinced that something wasn't right with the way that the car looked. Cari had always kept her house clean, but her car was always a hot mess, which I feel this. My house is fine, but my car is gross. And Cari was the same way. But Nancy thought that it was weird how clean Cari's car was when she'd gotten it back, but she just kind of brushed it off thinking that the evidence technician had probably cleaned the car out during evidence collection, and she just let it go. Now, Dave and Liz were still both receiving dozens and dozens and dozens of text messages and emails from Cari every day. But it had kind of brought them closer together. They were both going through the same thing, which is what tends to bring people closer together, and eventually Liz and Dave would start getting texts and emails at the same time while they were together. It was almost like Cari knew when they were together. Liz and Dave could be sitting on the couch in Dave's living room watching TV together, and their phones would ding simultaneously. They'd both get nasty texts and emails at the same time, and they'd started getting these texts and things while they were together pretty often. Dave and Liz had both come out of their houses at different points and found that their cars had been keyed. And the keying of the cars happened more than once. And it was after Cari had been reported missing for about 5 months or so that police showed up to ask Dave about a call that he'd made to Cari's mom, Nancy. Nancy had claimed that Dave had called her and said that he'd seen Cari at a homeless shelter, but when police, Nancy, and Cari's son Max showed up at the shelter, there hadn't been anyone staying in the shelter that matched Cari's description. And Dave had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. Dave didn't even have Cari's mom's phone number to be able to call her. Nancy had also gotten a separate Facebook message from Cari claiming that she was at a different shelter and asking her mom to come and get her, but police couldn't find anything to prove that Dave had made the call or, even anything that almost looked like Dave had been hiding something. And he was more confused than anything because he hadn't seen Cari and he definitely didn't know where she was. And the more weird and stalker-like things that kept happening, Liz and Dave had kind of coined the term Crazy Cari for when they were talking about, all the texts and emails that they'd gotten from Cari that day. Because it had gotten to a point where, Dave and Liz would meet up after work for dinner and then go back to Dave's house and read all of their quote-unquote Crazy Cari texts and emails that they'd gotten that day. They'd kind of joked and laughed and, they'd go back and forth about what Cari was rambling on about today. And then things got to a point where it wasn't so funny anymore. Because on August 17th, 2013, Liz called Dave and she was panicked. Her house was on fire. Cari had been missing for about 10 months at this point, and Liz was sure that her house had been torched by Cari. Luckily, Liz and her kids weren't home when the house was set on fire, but Liz lost multiple different house pets during the fire. She lost 2 dogs, a cat, and a pet snake. And, along with the pets, she'd also lost everything else in the fire. And it wouldn't be long before Dave would get text messages from Cari admitting that she did this entire thing. Shortly after the fire, Dave got a text that said something along the lines of, "Yes, I set that nasty whore's house on fire, and I hope that her and her kids die in the fire," which is scary as shit. Other things had happened, but they weren't this extreme, like the morning that Dave showed up to work to find that the building where he worked had been spray painted. The message on the side of the building said that Dave beats women. And I don't know how Dave wasn't fired, because this wasn't the first thing that had happened at his place of employment. The mechanic shop would often get, phone calls from someone asking, to speak with Dave, and then once he'd get on the phone, the caller would just hang up. The shop would also get a lot of random calls where no one would speak, but they wouldn't hang up, so they were just tying up phone lines. So Dave must have been a hell of an employee, because, even through all this, somehow he wasn't fired. Dave and a few of his coworkers had managed to get the spray paint off the walls at the mechanic shop. And Dave was just able to go about his regular shift at work after they'd gotten the spray paint off the walls of the shop. Like, this was becoming way too normal for him. In the book I listened to, it seems like even though Dave and Liz were still dating and growing closer because they were both dealing with the same kind of situation, you're not always going to find somebody that has a stalker at the same time as you, and you share the same stalker. But Dave was still dating other women on the online dating app that he'd been using. And Dave had met a woman named Jessica, and they talked about going out on an actual date. They had hit it off on the app, but, they hadn't actually met in person. But once they became Facebook friends, Jessica would also get a message from Cari. The message called Jessica a whore, and then, Cari told Jessica that Dave had herpes. So Jessica immediately confronts Dave, and he did admit that, yes, I have a crazy stalker, and that he'd only dated her for 2 weeks. But he did let her know that he didn't have herpes. And with this, Jessica explained that after she'd gotten another Facebook message from Cari saying that if she kept seeing Dave, that Cari would kill her and her kids. That's when Jessica was like, "Hey, you're probably a nice guy, but I've got enough going on and I can't have this." And Dave completely understood. It was a lot for him, much less some random woman that he'd only ever talked about going on a date with. But Dave had also gotten texts from Cari basically saying that, yes, she was the one who'd broken into Liz's house and stolen her checkbooks and written the bad $5,000 check from earlier. And it seems like anything criminal that Cari did, she would always text Dave and admit to her criminal behavior. Like, if his car got keyed, Cari would text that if he wasn't sleeping with so many women, then it wouldn't have gotten keyed. And after Liz's house burnt down, she just texted and was like, "Yep, burned her house down. Maybe she should stop sleeping with you." So Cari would text Dave and openly admit to whatever she had done at the time. It also wasn't out of the usual when Dave and Liz would be hanging out that they'd both get yet another angry and harassing text from Cari. It was becoming more along the lines of something that Dave and Liz had gotten used to dealing with, living with, and coping with. It was almost as normal to them as using the bathroom is to us, which is insane. But Liz feared for her kids' safety. Like, if Cari was willing to go as far as to burn her house down, then she would probably be willing to do anything. Meanwhile, police are still looking for Cari in Iowa and Nebraska for 2 totally different things. Cari's mom, Nancy, eventually took the steps to become Cari's son, Max's legal guardian, because at this point, none of Cari's family was sure when Cari was coming back, and if she did come back, what kind of state she would be in mentally when she got there. And I know y'all are all wondering, why didn't Dave just block Cari's number? Or why Liz and Dave both didn't just get new numbers, and they did. Dave and Liz had blocked Cari's number multiple times, but they'd also changed their phone numbers more times than they could count. Dave and Liz changed their numbers over and over and over and over and over and over again, and it never seemed to matter. The threatening texts and emails would start right back up just as quickly as they'd gotten new numbers. And Dave and Liz could never figure out how Cari kept getting their numbers. It got to a point where it almost seemed pointless to even try to get a new number. Like, what's the point? Because Cari would always somehow get the new numbers, and she'd always start right back up with the crazy Cari shit again. And all the different phone numbers that were used to send Dave and Liz threatening messages were all untraceable. They were coming from burner phones. Phones that you don't have an assigned contract with any certain company under anybody's name. A burner phone is more along the lines of like a prepaid type of phone plan, where you can use any fake name and any fake email address to get the phone turned on in order to be able to call, text, email, etc. on it. And Dave had stopped giving his phone number out just willy-nilly. Like, Dave was only giving his new numbers to a select group of people that he trusted to have it. And a lot of the emails that were sent to Liz and Dave were all sent from multiple different email addresses. Some of them had different variations of Cari's name, but most of them were different variations of Dave's name. Things like Dave's Girl, Cari at Gmail, or Kroupa Cari 76 at Hotmail, things like that. Dave's baby mama Amy was also still getting random texts from Cari too, and Dave was more concerned about the well-being of his ex-girlfriend and his kids than anything. Liz had even gone so far as to respond to Cari in one of her crazy texts. Cari had texted Liz asking her to stay away from Dave, and Liz responded saying that if Cari would just leave her alone, she'd never see Dave again. Like, sure, she liked Dave, but not enough to deal with this for more than a year and a half. Because yes, this had been going on for over a year and a half now. And even when Liz tried to bury the hatchet with Cari and call a truce, the constant texts and emails never stopped. And I don't remember exactly where in this timeline this happened, but at one point, Cari had sent Dave an email or a text, and it was just a picture of a woman that looked a lot like Liz tied up in the back of a car. The text read something along the lines of, like, TikTok, implying that Dave needed to hurry up and save Liz. Cari made a few threatening remarks about having Liz tied up in the back of her car, and basically Cari told Dave that she needed to call Liz and tell her that he was done with her or Cari was going to kill her. But Dave had been dealing with this crazy Cari stuff for far too long he wasn't buying this. He immediately called Liz to see if she had actually been kidnapped and if she was actually tied up in the back of a car. Liz just kind of laughed it off and said that no, she was fine, and that she couldn't believe how far Cari had taken things already. Which at this point, I don't know how any of this stuff would faze you. If someone had been watching and stalking and threatening you for well over a year now, then, at what point do you kind of get numb to it all? At what point do you just kind of learn to live with it and let it go? I don't know, but that's where Liz and Dave were at this point. They were just kind of living with it and not even letting it faze them. And as far as police were concerned, it seemed like Cari was kind of hiding out from all the crimes that she'd committed. The stalking, the threats, the harassment, the burning down somebody else's house, and so on and so forth. I mean, things had actually gotten so bad that at one point, only about 6 months into the stalking, a fake obituary showed up on Remembered.com. This obituary listed Liz's date of birth, month, and year, and it also listed her date of death as May 11th, 2013. And Remembered.com is a place for grieving family members and friends where they can go and post about their loved ones' obituaries and, any memories or, whatever. Liz's obituary caption read something along the lines of, "I didn't know her very well except that she was a man-stealer." The link to the site was sent to Dave, and then Cari had gone so far as to send Dave an email asking if he knew anyone that would be willing to kill Liz and her quote-unquote ugly-ass kids. And naturally, when Dave showed Liz the post and this fake obituary, Liz was scared shitless. This was the constant crazy type of shit that Dave and Liz had just gotten used to. Dave's car and Liz's car had been keyed multiple times, and at one point, Dave's car had written on the side of it in key scratches, "Dave loves fat whores." And they'd filed multiple different protective orders against Cari, so they didn't have a choice but to get used to it, or it would probably have just driven them crazy. So Dave and Liz had received literal thousands and thousands of texts and emails, and it had almost been 3 years since Cari had been reported missing, when in 2015, 2 new detectives decided to take a look at Cari's missing person case. Detective Ryan Avis and Detective Jim Doty decided to look at this case from 2 separate angles. They legitimately volunteered to take this case on. Both of these detectives had heard about Cari's missing persons case around the office, and they both wondered, how does a responsible mom, daughter, and employee just up and vanish without a trace? So the way that they decided to approach this case was that Detective Jim would be looking at it from the angle that Cari was already dead, and that she'd been dead this entire time. And Detective Ryan Avis was going to look at this case from the angle that Cari was still alive and that she had just decided to go missing. And if that was the case, they should be able to figure all this out pretty quickly and pretty easily, which is kind of genius because I feel like a lot of the times that police get dead set tunnel vision on one theory and they don't even look at other options. So both detectives started digging through old case files, and from the beginning, they were aware of Cari's bipolar diagnosis. And they'd also both agreed that they didn't think that her bipolar diagnosis had anything to do with Cari being missing, so that was out. This is when Ryan Avis, who was working the case as if Cari was still alive, noticed that Cari's bank accounts hadn't been touched in years. And Detective Avis says, quote, "It's not normal for adults to just up and leave and literally spend no money. No one's seen them and no one's heard their voice. It just didn't make sense. She had a good income, a good house, and I had come to the conclusion that I could not prove that she was actually alive." But they both thought that it was extremely unusual for an adult to just up and vanish without taking any of her things and any of her money. Something just sounded fishy about it all. And these two detectives also thought that it was hella weird that Cari had only been communicating with anyone through texts and emails, and that she absolutely refused to actually talk to anybody on the phone. So it didn't take Detective Ryan Avis very long to come to the conclusion that Cari was most likely not alive anymore, and that it was extremely likely that Cari had been dead for this entire 3 years that she'd been stalking Dave and Liz. So from here, both Detective Jim Doty and Detective Ryan Avis figured that they'd better start digging into this case a little bit further. They were able to get Cari's case moved from a missing persons case to a homicide case. Now, they were sure that Cari had been killed, but they weren't sure by who. And when Ryan Avis and Jim Doty went to Cari's mom, Nancy, and they told her that she had most likely been right about Cari's odd behavior this entire time. And these two detectives had only recently started looking into Cari's missing persons case, and it was almost a miracle when, in December of 2015, Liz walked into the police station to file yet another harassment report against Amy, Dave's ex-girlfriend and baby mama. Liz told the officers that she'd been thinking about it, and it just didn't seem like it would be Cari that had been the one doing all the stalking over a man that she'd only dated for 2 weeks, and that she thought it had to be Amy. So Detective Avis and Doty had spotted Liz when she'd come into the station, and this could not have been a more perfect opportunity for them. They were very aware of who Liz was, and Liz didn't know who they were. Liz's name was on any kind of paperwork that was related to Dave's stalking or Cari's disappearance. So they let her file her report on Amy, and then they let Liz leave. But within a half hour, Detective Avis was in his car and on his way to Liz's house to pretend to do a follow-up interview with her. He had knocked on Liz's door and she invited him in. Now, this detective really missed his calling as an actress because once he sat down with Liz and started asking her questions, he was kind of like, okay, so this whole time you thought that Cari Farver was the one stalking you, and now you think that it's probably Dave's ex-girlfriend Amy. And Liz immediately corrects the way that he, purposely mispronounced Cari's last name. Liz even goes so far as to spell Farver out for the detective. So, Avis is really doing the most during this interview, and it is hilarious. Liz had no idea that she's his main suspect in Cari's disappearance, and he wants to keep it that way for now. Something just wasn't sitting right with the way that Liz was involved in every aspect of this case, but was only a casual hookup for Dave, and somebody that Cari had passed by once and never even met. So Liz let Detective Avis know that while she was already there talking to him, that Dave had bought a gun for his protection, and the newly bought gun had been stolen. Dave didn't know how someone had gotten in his house, but, he had just recently reported it stolen. Detective Avis explains that if they do a phone dump on Liz's phone, then they'll be able to build a better case against whichever woman had been stalking Liz this whole time. And he tells her that they'll talk to Dave and get a phone dump done on his phone too. And this would give police access to all the texts and emails that had been sent from Cari's phone to both of their numbers. So both Liz and Dave signed a waiver saying that they agreed to let police do a phone dump on both of their phones. And just so we're all clear, a phone dump transfers files from, a phone to another device that gives the police access to just go over all those files that were transferred without the police actually having to have your phone with them at the station. A phone dump collects things that are still on the phone, but it also collects things that may have been deleted from the phone. And even if those things that had been deleted had been added to the trash or junk section of the phone, it would still pull up. So this would give police access to everything on both phones. And there had been files transferred from Liz and Dave's phone back in 2013, just months after Cari had been reported missing. But the few things that were found didn't really seem like much more than normal phone activities. And aside from that, they were looking at Liz and Dave as victims in 2013, and now the tables have turned and Liz is a suspect. So it's 2015 now, and police are going through their phone activities again. And with that, police find a picture, a pretty disturbing picture. And it had been taken on Liz's phone, and it was of a woman that looked a lot like Liz that was tied up and duct taped in the back of a car. So this seems like a picture of Liz, who had taken a picture of herself tied up in a trunk of a car and duct taped. The phone data showed that this picture wasn't a screenshot and that it had not been sent to Liz's phone. It had actually been taken from Liz's phone. And suddenly things started clicking into place. But this picture had been taken before Cari had ever been reported missing. So the two new detectives also find calls from Liz's phone to Cari's phone using the *67 thing. And *67 is used to block a caller from being able to see who's calling when the ID pops up. That doesn't work when you agree to a phone dump, and I guess Liz was unaware of that. They can clearly see that Liz had called Cari's phone trying to block her own number at least 6 times. And all 6 of these phone calls had also been made before the time that Cari had been reported missing. So what reason would Liz have to be calling Cari's phone 6 different times before she was ever reported missing? That's what they need to figure out. And the detectives are like, maybe something is up with this shit. Seems like Liz knows more than she's letting on. Maybe let's look a bit more into Liz. But that's not all they find, though. They also find yet another clue that seems to positively connect Cari and Liz to each other. So the next thing that the detectives find is a text that Cari had sent to her mom, Nancy, a while back. And this text from Cari was asking her mom, Nancy, to unlock the door to her house so someone could be let in that was supposed to be coming by and buying some of Cari's furniture. Detectives find that Cari's mom, Nancy, had been asking questions after she'd gotten this text from Cari, who she hadn't seen in forever. Like, why would Cari be selling all of her furniture? And detectives can see the text where Nancy is telling Cari, or, this supposed imposter of Cari, that she doesn't believe she's actually talking to her daughter and that she doesn't think that Cari would even be trying to move. And then detectives find where Cari had sent her mom, Nancy, a picture of a check for the furniture to prove that she was being legit about selling her furniture and that it was nothing more than that. And when detectives pull up a picture of this check that Cari had sent to her mom, they can clearly make out a signature on the bottom of the check. And once they realized the name on the check, puzzle pieces started snapping together more obviously and more quickly than they'd ever had before in this case. Because after they seen the name on the check, detectives were even more confused. The check had been signed by Shanna E. Goyer. And I know that name doesn't sound familiar to y'all, but here's where the lifetime-worthy kind of plot twist comes into play. Liz's birth name is Shanna Goyer, and she only went by Liz as a nickname. So now, this entire time of, over the last 3 years that Liz had been stalking and calling police, she had been telling them that she was sure that if it wasn't Crazy Cari that was stalking and harassing her, then it would have had to have been Dave's longtime ex-girlfriend, Amy. Liz had filed a few different harassment reports against Amy over the years, too, and she was so clear that it either had to be Cari or Amy. So now they have something that actually ties Liz to Cari, which is something that nobody had been able to put together up until this point, because up until now, the two women didn't have any kind of connection aside from both of them casually dating Dave. But with that, the two detectives were able to finally run Liz's fingerprints against the fingerprint that they'd found in the mint container that had been found in Cari's Ford Explorer by the evidence technician. And lo and behold, the fingerprint that was found on the mint container in Cari's car belonged to Liz Goyer. And just think about that for a second. What reason would Liz have to ever need to be inside of Cari's car for any reason? For any length of time at all, ever. Because I can't think of even one good reason. Eventually, these detectives go talk to Dave, and they tell him that they think that Liz had been the one behind all of the stalking. So they basically tell Dave that Liz had not only been the one stalking him, but that she'd also been stalking herself, which is probably the wildest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. And Dave's like, okay, hey, this all sounds fine and good, but I've actually been in the same room with Liz when we both gotten text or emails from Cari, so I don't think it could have been Liz doing it. Police look into this a little bit further, and they realize that Liz had some kind of app on her phone that would schedule text messages and emails. And with this scheduled text and email app, Liz would be able to set a time and pick a date to send a certain email or text to herself or Dave. So she would have easily been able to send crazy, wild, and random texts to herself and to Dave while they were both in the same room hanging out. Like, Liz could have set it to go off on her phone and on Dave's phone at the same time, in the same day, when she knew that her and Dave would be together. That would be a surefire way for Dave to never expect or suspect that it was actually Liz doing all of this the whole time. For 3 years, Liz's planning and scheduled texts and emails had worked. Dave had never, not once, suspected that his stalker might be Liz and not Cari. But this would have meant that Liz would have burned her own house down, let all 3 of her pets die on purpose, keyed her own car multiple times, spray-painted her own garage walls, spray-painted the walls at Dave's work. But if Cari had been dead for all of this, then that would have also meant that Liz was the one that wrote her own obituary and sent it to Dave. That's not all, though. Liz would have had to have been the one texting and emailing Cari's moms, Nancy, and her son, Max, trying to convince them both that she was still alive and okay, she just didn't want to be found. And Dave just could not believe what these detectives were trying to say. He and Liz had been through so much together, and it wasn't until detectives laid out every piece of cold hard evidence that they'd found, and there really wasn't much denying that. Between the calls to Cari's phone before she was ever reported missing, the check that had been made out to Cari for some used furniture signed by Liz, also before Cari had been reported missing, the schedule and text apps, the pictures that were found, with all of that, Dave really had a hard time denying that all of this had to be Liz. He also had a hard time denying that the last 3 years of hell that he'd been through had been done by the only woman that he thought was going through the same exact thing as him. And this seems like one of those things where once you see something, you can't unsee it. Like, once Dave put all the pieces together, he had no choice but to say, yep, all of this had to have been Liz and not Crazy Cari like he thought this whole time. And suddenly the nickname Crazy Cari didn't fit anymore. Suddenly it sounded more like an insult to the smart, beautiful, and vivacious woman that Dave had remembered Cari to be those first 2 weeks that they'd spent together, before she earned the nickname Crazy Cari. But now that he's thinking about it, Cari and Liz had no part in each other's lives up until Cari had been reported missing. And out of all the women that Dave had dated, why would Cari have been so laser-focused on Liz? Because Dave had still been casually dating even through these 3 years that he and Liz were off and on. So these 2 detectives go straight to Nancy and Cari's son Max, and they tell them that they believe that what Nancy has suspected all along, and that Cari was actually missing, and that they believed her. They didn't think that it was her sending the emails and texts to family and friends, and Nancy was finally validated that her motherly instincts weren't wrong. And this is when police compiled all the emails and texts that Cari had supposedly sent to Dave, and all the emails and texts that Cari had supposedly sent to Liz as well. And Dave had also started to notice a pattern with Liz early on in their non-committal style relationship, where she was obviously expecting more out of him than what he was planning to offer. Liz would text Dave and ask what his plans were for the night, and if he said that he had plans to go on a date with someone else, then Liz would just randomly show up at his house and only stay long enough for sex. It took Dave a good 3 or 4 times of this happening before Dave figured out exactly what Liz was trying to do. But Dave didn't let that stop him or slow him down. He knew that he didn't need to be tied down and that he didn't want a relationship at the time. Liz would also do things like beg Dave to stop seeing other women and just be monogamous with him, even though he'd always been very clear that he didn't want a relationship. So there were some early warning signs, but they were all just really badly overlooked. Liz had also asked Dave for a few other things that he wasn't exactly comfortable with giving her. Liz had asked for 1 day a week to be set aside for just the 2 of them, just for Liz and Dave. And she'd also asked Dave if he would be willing to commit for her for just 4 weeks to see where his head was at after 4 weeks was up. And it seemed like no matter how nicely and politely Dave tried to refuse and say no, Liz would just keep pushing for what she wanted more than anything from Dave, a commitment. But Dave had an especially hard time saying no to Liz because out of all the women that he'd casually dated after Cari, They'd all bailed once they'd gotten raging angry texts and emails from Cari threatening them if they didn't stop talking to Dave. And Liz had been the only one that had stuck by his side throughout that entire experience. But then again, no one besides Liz really understood what Dave was going through with Cari. So if they didn't share anything else, then they at least shared the stalking behaviors that both of them were experiencing from Cari. We also later find out that when Cari supposedly resigned from her job and she'd given the name of a woman that could replace her, that woman's name was also Shanna Goyer. So Liz had tried to, replace Cari at her job even though she was not a programmer. And then at one point early on in the investigation, Cari's parents had been worried about her valuable items being left home without anybody being there. So they moved all the stuff to a storage building. But when Cari's parents had asked police to go to Cari's place just to look and see if anything was out of place, the police had went by there early on in the investigation and took pictures of everything. Because at that point, they weren't sure what might be able to be used as evidence later on if something had actually happened to Cari and if she wasn't just missing on her own. There were pictures taken of a camera box, an old tripod for a camera, a deck of cards, an unfinished crossword puzzle, and an empty mint container. This officer took things from the house to put in a potential evidence locker. And he'd taken a daily planner and a resume that Cari had typed out that had handwritten notes on it, along with some of Cari's medication. But there was never anything that was found that they thought they might be able to use as evidence, at least until these puzzle pieces started falling into place. But if you can believe it, things get even crazier in this case, because it was the very next day when Liz went into the police station and Detective Avis went out to pretend to follow up with Liz, and Liz had agreed to do a phone dump. So we're the very next day after that. A call comes in to 911. Liz had been at Big Lake Park just enjoying some time to herself when someone, a woman, had come up behind her and shot her in the leg. During the 911 call, Liz says that she doesn't know who it was that had shot her, but then later on she claims that she thought she'd seen the woman and heard the woman's voice and that it sounded a lot like Amy. Liz even mentioned that she'd seen a car parked in the parking lot that looked a lot like Amy's car. So naturally, police still have to do their job no matter what they suspect Liz of doing. So police show up at Amy's house and they ask her about where she'd been at the time of the shooting and if she could prove it. And it was very, very easily able to be figured out that Amy had not been anywhere near the park at the time of the shooting and that she'd been home with her kids. Amy was cleared as a suspect pretty quickly. So it wasn't Amy who had taken a shot at Liz. Detectives give Liz a couple of weeks to heal from her gunshot wound, and then they devise a plan. A genius plan at that, but a plan nonetheless. Because the 2 weeks that Liz had been healing from her gunshot wound, detectives were having the phone downloads done on Liz and Dave's phone. They had put more than 3,000 man-hours into going through texts and emails. They were able to find more than 30 different email addresses on Liz's phone, and eventually, with a lot of time and energy, they're able to see that every email address and every text message all link back to Liz in some way. The texts and emails were connected to either Liz's home IP address or they were sent from a device that Liz would have had access to. And if she didn't have access to a device, then they were linked back to her personal devices. I mean, of course, they figured out that Liz had been scheduling the texts and emails, but after they had gone through all the information on Liz's phone, they realized the amount of time and energy that had been put into this. It would have had to have taken Liz anywhere from 40 to 50 hours a week to schedule and type up all of these emails and texts. So this was basically the equivalent of working a full-time job with as much as she was putting into stalking herself and Dave and trying to make it all seem like Cari was the one behind it. All 30 or so of the email addresses were some kind of variation of Cari's name. So let's get back to the plan that the detectives put in place, because they went and did some real-life Criminal Minds type of shit. They left Liz alone for 2 weeks and let her heal from her self-inflicted gunshot wound because they kind of figured out what Liz had been up to this whole time, and they wholeheartedly believed that she'd shot herself in the leg for who knows what reason. But the detectives decided that they're going to make Liz think that they need her help, so they bring her in for questioning and they drop a bombshell. They tell Liz that they had finally found human remains and that they were sure that the remains belonged to Cari. Now, keep in mind, they hadn't actually found remains, but they did think that Cari was dead, and they did think that Liz had been involved. So they asked for Liz's help. They asked Liz if she knew of anyone that might want to hurt Cari or anyone who may have wanted Cari killed. And at this point, the two detectives figured out that Liz obviously thinks she's smarter than everybody else around her. So they felt like they knew exactly what would happen when they asked Liz for help. Liz says that she didn't know Cari at all, so she definitely didn't know her well enough to know if she had enemies or not. But she did know that Dave had been with Amy for 12 years, and basically if anyone was going to be jealous about Dave, it would be Amy. And Detective Doty plays right into Liz's bullshit, and he needed Liz to think that he believed her and that he thought that Amy was behind it all. He also needed Liz to believe that he thought that Amy had been the one that killed Cari too. So he tells Liz that if Amy was bold enough to shoot her in a public setting, that Amy would probably have been bold enough to kill Cari. And the detective tells Liz that they could really use her help in this case. He tells Liz that if she gets any emails or text or anything from Amy at all about what might have happened to Cari, to let him know immediately. Because obviously they had to get this crazy, dangerous woman, Amy, off the streets, and Liz agrees. These detectives knew that Liz would do or say whatever she needed in order to get Amy out of Dave's life, even if it meant Amy being in jail for killing Cari. But police already knew that Amy wasn't involved in Cari's case at all, but they couldn't let Liz know that. And it would only be a few days before Liz would start forwarding emails over to detectives who were working on Cari's case. These emails were supposedly from Amy, and one email said, quote, "I shot you, Liz, to make Sue," and I think she meant sure, "to make sure Dave stayed away from you. I used out kids' keys to break in." Again, I think she meant I used our kids' keys to break in. "Get on his phone with the codes we both use, and that's when I took his gun and some ammo. I got rid of the gun. Look, the police haven't arrested me. No one had no proof it was me. So you're screwed, Liz. You better stay away from Dave, or next time it will be worse for you." And I can confirm that this first email and all of the other ones I read were full of grammar mistakes, misspelling, not a single corrected punctuation, but that's besides the point. So Liz had written this email up to make it look like it had come from Amy, and she just forwarded it right over to detectives like, "Here, guys, you needed proof that Amy was the one that shot me? Here you go. She just flat out admitted it to me in this email she sent." Like, come on. And this is exactly what Detectives Doty and Avis were looking for. So now Detective Avis calls Liz, and he's like, "Oh, this is good stuff. Email Amy back and see if she'll give us any more details on Cari's murder or what happened to her." Because again, detectives believed that Liz was responsible for whatever happened to Cari. They just needed Liz to help build her own case against herself, because they knew that she would. And just like magic, it was only a few days and detectives were looking at new emails that Liz had sent, saying that all these were replies that Amy had sent to her once she started asking about Cari's disappearance and murder. In this email that was supposedly sent to Liz from Amy, it detailed things about Cari's murder. It said that she'd met up with Cari at a local spot and she'd attacked her. It said, quote, "So when I met Crazy Cari, she would not stop talking about Dave and him being her husband. She tried to attack me, but I attacked her with a knife. I stabbed her 3 or 4 times in the chest and stomach area. I then took her out and burned her. I stuffed her body in a garbage bag and crap, and she was carried out to the dumpster, probably when Dave took my garbage out for me. So be glad I did not do you that way, Liz." Lord, she really needs to go back to grammar. So Liz is literally typing out all these emails and pretending that Dave's ex-girlfriend Amy was sending them to her. And for Liz to be saying all these different types of things about the attack on Cari and how her body was disposed of, detectives knew that Liz was probably sprinkling in a little dash of the truth throughout these fake emails that were supposedly from Amy. And detectives knew that Liz's worst fear was Dave getting back together with his baby mama and ex-girlfriend Amy. So detectives go to Dave and they ask if he would be willing to move back in with Amy and the kids just temporarily while they finish building their case against Liz. And of course, Dave's going to do whatever he needs to in order to wash his hands of this stalker finally, who he now knows has been Liz all along. And it was only days after Dave moved back into the house with Amy that Detective Doty got a call from Liz. She was crying, she was hysterical, and you guessed it. She was crying because Amy hadn't been arrested yet. Liz says that she's upset because Amy had already shot her and that Amy had already killed Cari, and now she was living with Dave again and free to do whatever she wanted. And the detective tells Liz that they understand why she's upset and, there's something else that she can do to help them build a case against Amy and that they'll finally be able to arrest her for Cari's murder. So they ask Liz if she can email Amy again and just see if maybe this time she can get Amy to tell her details about Cari's murder that only the killer would know. And of course, they know Liz will fall right into this trap and they'll have an email by dinner time. And they weren't wrong, but this just proved a detective's point for them. They knew that Liz was the one typing the emails that she kept forwarding over to them. And they knew that Amy wasn't the one sending these emails to Liz. They knew that Liz was sending the emails to herself, and again, this plan worked like a charm. It wasn't long before Liz forwarded detectives another email that had supposedly come from Amy. And this time the emails just said that she flat out admitted that she'd killed Cari and that she'd done it in Cari's car. So now Liz had unknowingly given detectives a crime scene which they hadn't had before this. Liz really did dig her own grave, and she played right into their hand with these fake emails claiming that they were from Amy. So now police are like, that car was returned to the family and, Nancy and Cari's son Max should still have it. So they go see that, they do have Cari's old car still. Max had been driving the car around for years after it had been returned from the evidence technicians. Except this time when they went through the car looking for evidence, they're almost positive this is actually where the murder happened. So this time they pull up the carpets and they pull the fabric off the actual seats, and lo and behold, there's a huge red stain on the cushion in the car and the seat. And once this stain was tested, it was revealed to be human blood. Now, detectives ran the blood that they'd collected against Cari's DNA and found that it was a match. So now they needed to get Liz into the station just so they could let her know that the gig was up. They can finally reveal that she's been a suspect and not the detective's little handy helper this whole time. Now they have hardcore evidence because before this, everything that had been found had been digital. But this blood that was found in Cari's car changed the case from a missing persons case to a homicide case. So a cold case detective was able to find a reason to bring Liz in for questioning when they realized that she had a warrant out for a traffic citation. So they bring Liz in for questioning and they bring her in handcuffs this time. But this cold case detective was not playing these games with Liz. He got straight to the point, asking why Cari's phone would have pinged at Liz's house after Cari had already been reported missing. She says that she doesn't know. Then he asked her how her fingerprints had gotten in a mint container that was found in Cari's car. And again, Liz says that she doesn't know the answer to that question either. That she'd never been inside of Cari's car and that she didn't even know Cari. The detective asked how all of the text messages and emails that Cari had supposedly sent to herself and Dave came from Liz's home IP address. And again, Liz does not give up. She keeps saying that she doesn't know how they found all this evidence because she didn't do anything. So finally, he's like, look, we know that all those emails that you said Amy had been sending where she admitted to all kinds of crimes were actually typed out and sent by you. He's basically just telling her to give it up. And Liz will die on this hill of innocence, which is fine because she's in jail. Police finally think they have enough actual evidence to charge Liz with Cari's murder, and she's arrested. But while the cold case detective is questioning Liz, the other detectives have gotten a search warrant for Liz's apartment. And during this search, they find a camera that they know belonged to Cari and a video recorder that they also knew belonged to Cari. So Liz had a camera and a video recorder that had belonged to Cari for years, and she had just been storing it like an old keepsake. They also found a video recording of Cari, and it's believed that this is the last video recording that Cari made. In the video, Cari was talking about how someone had spray painted her son's Ford Explorer during the night, and how they were going to go outside and try to remove the spray paint. And we've all figured out by now that the spray paint on the garage and the spray paint on Liz's walls, that was all Liz. So it's not really far-fetched to think that Liz would probably have been the one to spray painted Cari's son's car. Because Liz sure does love to spray paint. You know how some people are like, I sure do love to paint with watercolors, or I sure do love to paint clay pots. Liz is like, I sure do love to spray paint shit that doesn't belong to me. So now Liz has a really good defense attorney, and he wasn't stupid. He knew that they needed to rush this case to trial because they haven't found a body yet. And a lot of the times, no body means no crime. Liz declined to have a jury decide her fate, and she opted for the judge to rule over her case instead. And it was obvious from the jump that the judge was going to take some serious convincing that all of this crazy shit that had happened had all been done by one woman who was jealous of someone that she had only dated off and on for a few months. The trial was set to start in just a few months, so detectives go by and they fill Dave in on their progress and about what's going on in the case. And the detectives asked Dave, just like they did every other time that they were done talking to him about the case and when they were getting ready to leave. They had always asked him before they left if there was anything else that he could think of just to kind of let them know. And for whatever reason, Dave remembered something in this instance that would turn this case on its head. Dave tells him that he had an old tablet of his that had been in storage, And he says that, the tablet had been in storage for a few years and that Liz had used it from time to time before he stuck it in the storage locker. So, of course, they asked Dave if he can go find it. And once Dave brings the tablet in, to be looked through by the tech guy that was working on, all the emails and calls and text, at first, it looks like the tablet was blank with nothing of value on it until the tech guy sees there's an SD card in it. So he pulls the SD card out of the slot and he sticks it in his computer. What he found was thousands and thousands of deleted pictures from the SD card that had been inside that tablet. Turns out the SD card had also been in Liz's phone at one point. But then there was one picture that was found throughout all these thousands of pictures that had been deleted from the SD card. And this picture was just kind of odd looking. And while the picture was examined further, they realized that this was a picture of a decomposing foot. But in the picture, you can also see on the foot that there's a small Chinese symbol tattooed. So after doing some digging, they learned that the tattoo on the foot in the picture matched a tattoo that Cari had on her foot. The Chinese symbol stood for the word mother because Cari loved being a mom and also because she was so close with her own mom. With this new picture of what was clearly Cari's decomposing body, the prosecutors are feeling a whole lot better about trying this case now. Because they may not have a body, but they have proof that someone had taken a picture of Cari's body. When she was very obviously dead, the foot was decomposing in the picture. They also had the fingerprint that put Liz inside of Cari's car and the fact that she had obviously been stalking herself and Dave pretending to be Cari for 3 years now. And then, of course, let's not forget all the emails that Liz had typed out and sent while she was pretending to be Amy, basically admitting to burning the body and putting everything in a trash can to be thrown in the dumpster. And there was reportedly a burn barrel in Liz's backyard for months after Cari had been reported missing, but after Liz set her own damn house on fire, the barrel was removed and nobody really knows where it was taken to or what happened to it. But my guess would be that that's how Liz disposed of Cari's body. Liz Goyer was convicted of the first-degree murder of Cari Farver, and she still claims that she's innocent to this day. Yada, yada, yada. Liz was sentenced to life in prison, and I seriously hope she rots there. But while I was reading the book on this case, I learned that Liz had a son before she had her other kids, and that she likely killed that son too. Liz's son was 15 months old when her new boyfriend at the time went in and saw that the baby was unresponsive and looked lifeless. Liz's new boyfriend apparently had some learning disabilities, and his mom said that you could almost convince him of anything. Like if you told him the sky was green seriously enough, then he would just believe you without ever looking up to check it for himself. So when it was found that Liz's 15-month-old son had died from shaken baby syndrome, Liz kind of convinced this man that he had bounced the baby on his leg while he was playing and that that's what had killed him. Her boyfriend was even convicted of this murder of her 15-month-old son because he basically went to police and said that he'd killed his girlfriend's baby and that it was an accident. He served 8 years in prison for the murder of Liz's 15-month-old son that he likely did not harm in any way. It's even been reported while Liz has been in prison that she'll often ask people to call her Cari instead of Liz, and I swear this makes me wonder what kind of undiagnosed mental health issues are going on with Liz's head. Because that is not normal behavior. None of that is normal. Cari's family were finally able to start the grieving process, even though Cari's body has still never been found, and I doubt it ever will be. But at least now, Cari's son Max knows that his mom didn't just abandon him, and her mom Nancy knows that she's with her dad in a better place now. Cari had essentially been killed twice by Liz. The first time Liz actually murdered Cari, and the second time, Liz made it her life mission to make everyone believe that Cari was crazy. So even in death, Liz was still killing Cari's reputation and memories that people had of her. Cari's mom, Nancy, just wants people to remember Cari for how smart she was, what a badass mom she was, and Cari's family wants everybody to remember all the good things that she'd done in her short life, and all the things that she could have accomplished had it not been so tragically ended. And on that note, I think that's all I have for you this week. This was a lot longer than I'd planned, but it's fine. If you like the show, please take a minute and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. You can actually leave a review on Apple, and you can rate it 1 out of 5 stars on Spotify. Follow the socials by searching Mama Murdered a Podcast on Facebook and by searching Murdered_Mama on Instagram and Twitter. And as always, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.